taking up the third chapter in the unit. Right, we've done populations, we've covered biodiversity, and now ecosystem. Yes, sorry.
Are cyclones obligate parasites?
Cyclostomes,
Yeah.
obligate parasites. We'll have to check. They're ectoparasites, but I'm not sure if they're obligate parasites. Now this chapter again is referring to one of the levels of ecological hierarchy. Right, if you remember our ecological hierarchy starts from organism, population, community, ecosystem. So again, exploring one of the levels of this hierarchy. An ecosystem can be visualized as a functional unit of nature wherein living organisms interact among themselves. This is the first kind of interaction, and also with the surrounding physical environment. So we are seeing a functional unit of nature where we see two types of interactions. One wherein organisms interacting within themselves, and second, organisms interacting with their environment. So we have biotic and abiotic components. So biotic interacting amongst themselves and biotic interacting with abiotic also. It varies greatly in size from a small pond to a large forest or a sea. And many of these ecologists regard the entire biosphere as a global ecosystem. So you can have a large global ecosystem, you can have macro ecosystems, you can have micro ecosystems. The size of the ecosystem also can be defined. Now ecosystems mainly are classified as terrestrial and aquatic. Right? Terrestrial mein we have forest, grasslands and desert as some of the examples. Aquatic mein we have ponds, lakes, wetlands, rivers, estuaries. I hope you know what's an estuary, right? Meeting point of marine and fresh estuary. Crop fields and aquarium may be considered as man-made ecosystems. Please underline, instead of the term man-made, they can use another term here in the exam as anthropogenic. I'll tell you why they'll use that term. Anthropogenic, because they have used this term in the chapter of evolution. They've used this term anthropogenic in evolution. So it is understood that you have to know anthropogenic means man-made. So instead of using it there, they can use it here also. Now every ecosystem to function, the most primary thing to run the ecosystem is the requirement of energy. So every ecosystem will require an input, and that input is termed as productivity. Did we come across productivity in the previous discussion? If you remember that point, it varies from year to year, and that time we had made a note that this productivity is actually referring to photosynthetic output. Right now, so input, photosynthetic input for the ecosystem. So can different ecosystems differ in terms of their productivity? So productivity of a desert will be much less. Productivity of a rainforest will be very high. Transfer of energy. The energy trapped by the green plants, converted into its chemical form, then taken up by the herbivores, then taken up by the carnivores. So that is nothing but transfer of energy from one organism to the other, right? By means of food chains, food webs and nutrient cycling. And finally output. Output is degradation and loss of energy, right? Every time a plant is taken up by a herbivore, it does not imply that the entire energy gets transferred. There is loss of energy at each level also. So you have an input of the ecosystem, output of an ecosystem, and there is transfer of energy within the ecosystem also. So we will also look at the relationships, different cycles, chains, webs, food webs that are created as a result of these energy flows within the system. Now, as far as the structure and function of an ecosystem is concerned, there is interaction of biotic and abiotic, just as we saw at the start of the chapter. Interaction between biotic and abiotic. How many types of interaction? Two. Okay. That interaction results in a physical structure which is characteristic for each type of ecosystem. When you look at a desert, when you look at a rainforest, unka physical structure is different. And that physical structure is a result of this interaction. The physical structure is a result of this interaction. So we see a physical structure, लेकिन उस physical structure का reason क्या है? Interaction. So can this statement be put up as assertion reason, please? Identification and enumeration of plant and animal species will give the species composition of an ecosystem. When you study vertical distribution of different species at different levels, it is called as stratification. Please box that word, stratification. So when you have taller trees, then the little shorter shrubs, and the lower one is herbs. So you're looking at different in a vertical distribution manner. The same example they give. For example, trees occupy top vertical strata. Shrubs will be the second, and the herbs and grasses will occupy the most bottom layers. So when you look at species in a vertical distribution, this is called as stratification. Make a point there. The horizontal recognition is called zonation. They have not mentioned this right now. Horizontal, ये vertical distribution को we call it as stratification. Horizontal distribution is called as zonation. When you look at a piece of land right now, so you will go across the species right now, not from up to down. Now the components of the ecosystem, they are seen to function as a unit. Components mein you will have both biotic as well as abiotic. We said it is a functional unit of nature. When you want to identify, so these are the four processes which we need to learn. First is productivity. Second, decomposition, energy flow, and nutrient cycling. The chapter is all about these 4 points. The chapter is all about these 4 points only. So chapter mein you have to ascertain, you have to learn how ecosystem is a functional unit in nature by identifying these 4 points. And out of the 4, this has been removed from the new part of the syllabus. So you have only 3 points. Now out of these 3 points, we would like to look at the first 2 points in today's session. What is productivity? What is decomposition? Now to understand the functioning of an aquatic ecosystem, the example taken is a small pond. Now small pond is a fairly self-sustainable unit. Please underline, self-sustainable unit. यानी खुद की requirement वो खुद satisfy करेगा. It's a self-sustainable unit. A very simple example that can explain even the complex interactions which exist in an aquatic ecosystem. Just to make it a little easier for you, the entire discussion of the pond has been tabulated. The entire text is from the NCERT, nothing out of it, please. खाली इसको tabulate किया मैंने. As we said, every ecosystem has got biotic as well as abiotic component. So the abiotic component is the water, with all the dissolved inorganic, organic substances, the rich soil deposit at the bottom, the solar input, the cycle of temperature, day length, right? All the other all these will come under abiotic. Whereas biotic you will have the autotrophs, the heterotrophs and the decomposers. The autotrophs component including the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton will be the producers, if we remember long ago, diatoms. Okay, chief producers. Okay. Some algae. So second autotrophic component is algae. And the floating plants, submerged plants and marginal plants. So you will have plants which are floating on water, the floating hydrophytes, plants which are submerged. Remember Vallisneria? It is submerged, right? And there are plants which are marginal. Marginal का मतलब होता है they are found at the edge. This is the surface of water. Yeah? ये land रहेगा तुम्हारा. So you will find these plants having rooted here, लेकिन उनका stem ऊपर रहेगा. Roots पानी में खाली. Right now, so these are the submerged, the marginal ones. And what they are doing, marginal plants found at the edges. So you found at the edges is referring to marginal plants, not the previous two, please. The consumers are represented by zooplankton. We have pointed out this before also. Zooplanktons are the herbivores of aquatic ecosystem. So zooplanktons will feed on the phytoplanktons. So zooplanktons में again we have two varieties, the free swimming and the bottom dwelling form, right? Bottom dwelling के लिए भी term दिया है. I have given you term, Sanvi, remember? There is a term for floating and bottom dwelling. Floatings are always termed as pelagic and bottom ones are called as benthic. Benthic. Those are which are floating are called as pelagic and those at the bottom are called benthic. You want the spelling? Pelagic and benthic. The decomposers are fungi, bacteria, flagellates, especially abundant in the bottom of the pond. So first is the structure identified into two, abiotic and biotic. Now their interaction. The system performs all the functions of any ecosystem and of the biosphere as a whole. So first is conversion of inorganic to organic material with the help of the energy coming from the sun by the autotrophs. Consumption of the autotrophs by heterotrophs. So is the first point referring to productivity? Is the second point referring to transfer of energy now? And the third is decomposition and mineralization. So this is referring to decomposition now, the degradation of energy. So are we seeing all the parts which are required for that area to be labeled as an ecosystem now? So any small or large part to be labeled as an ecosystem should satisfy the following conditions. Right now, सबसे पहले उसके पास autotrophs होने चाहिए, heterotrophs होने चाहिए, right ना? Abiotic, biotic दोनों, और उनके बीच में interaction. जब ये सारे conditions satisfy हो गए तो हमको क्या मिलेगा? एक structure ecosystem का एक, right ना? Last but the most important, and throughout this entire structure we find unidirectional movement of energy. Who is the one responsible for trapping this energy? Aren't the producers? So they are trapping this energy which is coming from the sun. The producers are taken up by the consumers. So is this a transfer of energy from primary consumer then to secondary consumer to a tertiary consumer to a top level consumer? Is this nothing but transfer? But is this transfer unidirectional? This energy is not going back to the sun anyways. So this transfer of energy is unidirectional towards the higher trophic levels, right? We have mentioned trophic levels in our previous discussion. I told you every trophic level, troph means nutrition. Troph का मतलब होता है nutrition. So unidirectional movement of energy towards the higher trophic level and its dissipation. ये its का मतलब energy का dissipation. Dissipation of energy and loss. So how does dissipation and loss? Dissipation, loss are almost synonymous with each other. Dissipation is release and it is also counted as loss, as heat to the environment. So when you are talking about transfer of energy, so when a consumer, when a primary consumer, a herbivore consumes a plant, ऐसा नहीं कि जितना एनर्जी उसके पास है वो सब कंज्यूम कर लेगा. There will be loss of energy from that organism in the form of heat to the environment also. That is dissipation. That is dissipation. So energy is moving in unidirectional, but at the same time at every level there is loss of energy also. Coming to our first point, that is product. I said we are discussing 2 points today, productivity and decomposition. Productivity. A constant input of solar energy is the basic requirement for any ecosystem to function and sustain. Self-sustainable. I don't know what to say, self-sustainable. So, to sustain itself, right, the basic requirement is it should have a constant input of solar energy. Now, productivity is of 2 types. Sorry. Primary productivity and secondary productivity. First, we talk about primary. Now, what is primary production? See, in a nutshell, primary production or productivity is referring, जैसे मैंने last time बताया, photosynthetic output. Total photosynthesis कितना हो रहा है, right? वहां पर in the previous session itself, वहां पर और एक term आया था biomass. तो photosynthesis से हो क्या रहा है? We are converting solar into chemical, but generate क्या हो रहा है? उसमें biomass generate हो रहा है. It is being stored in the form of glucose, which is adding to the biomass of the plant. So production, so primary production is defined as the amount of biomass or the organic matter produced per unit area over a time period by plants during photosynthesis. It is expressed either in terms of weight or energy. So you can have either grams or kilocalories. Now, if you remember our last lecture ka point, when do you label a community as a stable community? When उसके productivity में variation, तब मैंने बताया था productivity एक measurable term है. Biomass को आप measure कर सकते हो, उसके units हैं, right ना? अब शायद इसको आप relate कर पाएंगे last time के point से. To compare the productivity of different ecosystems, right? So expressed in terms, the rate of biomass production is called productivity. Please ध्यान देना, यहाँ पर primary production है, यहाँ पर productivity है. The rate of biomass production, wherever rate comes, कौन सा element आ जाएगा? Time वाला element आ जाएगा. इसलिए उसके unit में क्या डाला? देखो grams per year आ गया और किलो कैलोरीज पर मीटर स्क्वायर पर ईयर. सो इज इट पर यूनिट एरिया ओवर अ पीरियड ऑफ टाइम पर ईयर आ गया, राइट? तो यूनिट्स आर क्वाइट अंडरस्टैंडेबल गोइंग अकॉर्डिंग टू द डेफिनेशन. It is divided. Now we're talking about primary productivity. Please, we're talking only about primary first. It is divided into gross primary productivity, GPP, and net primary productivity, NPP. The total amount of biomass generated by photosynthesis is GPP. Total amount. But this plant will be taken up by the primary consumers. But before that, won't the plant have its own respiratory requirements and processes? क्या उसके bodily processes नहीं होंगे? क्या उसके metabolism में खर्चा नहीं होगा? होगा definitely. So all the energy which is required by the plant itself and its own respiratory losses is counted as R. So from the gross, if you deduct the respiratory losses, it will result into net primary productivity. It will result into net primary productivity. So just as an example, for example, right now, let's say it has generated around 100 units. 100 units उसने generate किया है, but उसके खुद के requirements around 60 है. तो टोटल कितना बचेगा उसके पास? 40. Will this 40 be the biomass which will be taken up by the consumers?
Yes. We lost some.
Right now, total it has lost 60. So what is the NPP here? 40. So how will you define NPP? Right? ये देखो, GPP of an ecosystem is the rate of production of organic matter during photosynthesis. A considerable amount of GPP is utilized by plants in respiration. These are termed as R. So GPP minus R will be your NPP. Net primary productivity is the available biomass for consumption to heterotrophs. ये 160-40 तो खाली एग्जाम्पल के तौर पे दिया मैंने, तो 40 बच गया ना. So that NPP is the available. So what is available to the next level is the NPP, because R is utilized by the organism itself. Okay. Now if we understand photosynthesis properly, something very simple and basic. The light energy is converted into its chemical form. That chemical form is glucose, right? But this glucose is stored by the plants as starch. It is stored in the form of starch. So what is taken up by the primary consumer is the starch which is taken up. Starch, as we all know, is a complex carbohydrate, right? ना क्या बोलते हैं इसको? Polysaccharide, right? क्या होमो या हेटेरो? Homopolysaccharide.